To understand the hidden fault lines shaping today's America, we must first acknowledge a difficult truth. This country has never been a finished project. It was not born fully formed in that summer of 1776. Nor did it resolve its contradictions at Appomattox, nor did it reconcile its promises during the Civil Rights era. Instead, the United States has always existed in a perpetual contest between two opposing visions of governance. On one side stands the idea that democracy is strongest when ordinary people have access to political power, economic mobility, education, and the rule of law. On the other stands the belief that society functions best when a small, wealthy, self-appointed elite claims authority on the basis of tradition, religion, or supposed natural order. These two visions have battled for the soul of the republic since its inception. And today, as Americans struggle to make sense of political chaos, institutional erosion, and rising extremism, it is this old conflict, renewed, sharpened, and amplified, that defines the landscape. It is tempting to imagine the present moment as unprecedented, but history rarely offers us that luxury. The United States has been here before, in one form or another, whenever concentrated wealth begins to dominate public life, whenever political leaders embrace grievance as a strategy, or whenever institutions become too weak or too captured to serve the people they were designed to protect. The Gilded Age, for example, saw railroad barons and industrial magnates shape the nation's laws to their own advantage, while ordinary workers endured dangerous conditions, low wages, and a political system deliberately structured to silence them. That era ultimately produced reforms: antitrust legislation, expanded voting rights, labor protections, and a vision of government as a counterbalance to private power. But those reforms did not eliminate the core conflict. They only temporarily rebalanced it. The last half century brought a new cycle of imbalance. Beginning in the late 1970s, a coalition of wealthy activists, business elites, and political strategists launched an effort to dismantle the post-New Deal consensus. They argued that government itself, not corporate monopolies, not financial deregulation, not widening inequality, was the primary threat to American freedom. They funded think tanks, media outlets, and political candidates to advance this narrative, insisting that prosperity came not from shared investment, but from individualism unrestrained. And while these arguments were framed as economic theory, they carried unmistakable political consequences. By concentrating wealth, they concentrated power. By limiting government oversight, they enabled private actors to shape public policy without accountability. And by promoting resentment against government, they redirected public frustration away from the powerful and toward the very institutions capable of restraining them. These shifts did not occur in isolation. They overlapped with racial tensions, demographic change, and the transformation of the American South into the anchor of a new conservative movement. Political operatives learned that cultural grievance could mobilize voters more effectively than economic policy. Rather than addressing declining rural hospitals, stagnant wages, or the collapse of local manufacturing, leaders emphasized symbols, flags, slogans, mythology about a simpler past. They transformed political identity into a form of tribal belonging, where loyalty mattered more than policy outcomes. In doing so, they laid the groundwork for a style of politics that elevates anger over analysis, performance over governance, and division over common purpose. The fault lines of the modern era emerged from this convergence. One such fault line is the erosion of shared truth. For most of American history, citizens could disagree on interpretation while still acknowledging a basic set of facts. But as partisan media ecosystems hardened, and as certain political leaders discovered the power of misinformation, factual consensus evaporated. We saw this most dramatically in the early 2020 period, when a public health crisis became a political battlefield, and again during the attempt to overturn a democratic election. But the deeper problem predates those events. A significant portion of the population no longer recognizes traditional institutions, universities, courts, journalists, even scientific organizations as legitimate arbiters of truth. This fracture would have been unthinkable in earlier generations, yet it now defines the national conversation. Another fault line lies in the weakening of institutions themselves. Courts are increasingly viewed not as neutral guardians of constitutional principles, but as political extensions of the factions that appointed them. State legislatures gerrymander districts to entrench minority rule, executives expand their authority beyond historical limits. Congress alternates between gridlock and procedural brinkmanship, unable or unwilling to address systemic crises such as climate change, healthcare, or economic inequality. When institutions lose credibility, they lose the ability to mediate conflicts. And when they can no longer mediate conflicts, political extremism fills the vacuum. The final and perhaps most volatile fault line is socioeconomic inequality. When a small group accumulates extraordinary wealth while millions struggle to afford housing, healthcare, or education, the social fabric frays. People lose faith in fairness, in opportunity, in the idea that the rules apply equally to everyone. Historically, this is the moment when demagogues thrive. They promise quick solutions, identify scapegoats, and insist that only they can restore greatness. But their power depends on deepening, not healing, division. Today's America is shaped by the collision of all these forces. But it is also shaped by something else. A growing determination among ordinary citizens to reclaim the democratic project. We see it in rising civic engagement, in record-breaking voter participation, in renewed labor movements, and in the insistence that history, real, complicated, unvarnished history, matters. The United States has never advanced without citizens demanding that it live up to its ideals. And once again, we find ourselves in a moment where the nation's future depends on whether those demands grow stronger than the forces seeking to undo them. This is the landscape upon which the next chapters of American history will be written. And understanding these hidden fault lines is essential not because they predict the nation's collapse, but because they illuminate the choices that will determine whether American democracy continues to bend toward its promises or retreats from them. If the hidden fault lines shaping today's America seem unusually sharp, it is because they are built on decades of deliberate narrative engineering, an attempt not merely to reinterpret the American story, but to fundamentally rewrite it. To understand why the nation finds itself at such a precarious crossroads, we must examine how these rewritten narratives gained power, how they reshaped public perception, and why they continue to influence the country's political trajectory. The struggle to control America's story is nearly as old as the nation itself. In the early republic, elites worked tirelessly to frame the young country as a natural extension of their own interests. Enslavers in the South portrayed themselves as the guardians of liberty while holding millions of people in bondage. Industrialists in the North defended exploitative labor systems by invoking the language of opportunity and merit. These contradictions were not merely philosophical. They were political tools, ways to maintain systems of power while presenting them as the natural order of things. And because the United States has always placed enormous value on civic mythology, these narratives often achieved remarkable staying power. But the rewriting of the American story took on new and more sophisticated forms in the late 20th century. It was during this period that political strategists realized narrative could succeed where policy failed. After all, reshaping the public's understanding of the nation's past could reshape its expectations for the future. As one conservative activist wrote in the 1970s, the key to political dominance was not simply winning elections, but controlling the institutions that define reality. This meant think tanks producing historical reinterpretations, media outlets framing events through ideological lenses, and political operatives training candidates to speak in emotionally resonant, though historically questionable, mythologized language. One of the most powerful of these narratives was the idea of real America, a term that implied authenticity, purity, and legitimate ownership of the nation. Though never strictly defined, it was strategically coded. rural over urban, white over multiracial, Christian over pluralistic. The effect was to divide the country into two categories: those who were presumed to represent the nation and those who were granted conditional belonging. This rhetoric gained political traction because it appealed to nostalgia, a sense of loss, and the belief that cultural change was a form of dispossession. But beneath the emotional appeals lay a more structural purpose: to justify policies that favored entrenched power. The most enduring of these rewritten narratives is the belief that America's prosperity comes not from collective investment but from heroic individualism. This myth suggests that infrastructure builds itself, that markets regulate themselves, and that public goods, roads, schools, healthcare, clean water are simply natural features rather than the result of democratic negotiation and shared responsibility. By promoting this view, political leaders made it easier to dismantle regulatory protections, weaken unions, and slash programs that had supported millions. And because these policies were wrapped in the language of freedom, many citizens accepted them as patriotic rather than exploitative. The consequences of this narrative shift were profound. As government resources for public education, housing, and healthcare declined, communities fractured, wealth concentrated at levels unseen since the original Gilded Age, political power consolidated in state houses and courts that increasingly reflected the interests of donors rather than voters. And because many Americans had been taught to distrust public institutions, they were often left with nowhere to turn except those very private entities that benefited most from their vulnerability. Another rewritten narrative emerged in the realm of race. For decades, political actors argued that racism was not a structural system but merely a matter of individual prejudice. This claim allowed leaders to preserve discriminatory policies such as redlining, selective policing, voter suppression, and unequal school funding while insisting that the nation had become colorblind. When activists pointed to persistent inequity, they were accused of dividing the country or undermining patriotism. In effect, the narrative turned demands for justice into acts of aggression. And because the myth of the self-made American ran so deep, many people came to believe that inequality reflected personal failure rather than historical architecture. These narratives were not only misleading, they were political weapons. Once enough citizens accepted them, it became easier to justify extreme forms of minority rule. Gerrymandering, purges of voter rolls, restrictions on ballot access, and the use of state power to override local democratic decisions. In this environment, the rhetoric of freedom became detached from democratic participation and reattached to the interests of those already wielding significant power. Today, the effects of narrative manipulation shape nearly every major political conflict. We see it in the insistence that teaching accurate history is a form of indoctrination, while presenting mythologized versions of the past is somehow neutral. We see it in the claim that efforts to expand voting rights constitute fraud, while measures that shrink the electorate are framed as protection. We see it in the belief that regulating pollution represents government overreach, while the destruction of public lands and waterways is treated as a natural cost of progress. Perhaps the most dangerous of these modern narratives is the one that portrays democratic governance as inherently illegitimate when it produces outcomes certain factions dislike. This argument gained momentum in the early 2010s and reached a breaking point in early January of 2021, when political leaders actively encouraged citizens to reject the results of a lawful election. But the roots of this crisis reach back further to decades of messaging that framed political opponents not as fellow citizens, but as existential threats, and that portrayed compromise not as democracy's lifeblood, but as betrayal. Yet history offers a counterpoint. The United States has survived previous attempts to rewrite its story. The Lost Cause movement after the Civil War, the corporate propaganda campaigns of the early 20th century, the anti-democratic backlash to civil rights victories. In each case, these narratives gained traction because they offered simple explanations for complex problems. And in each case, they eventually encountered resistance from citizens who insisted that democracy requires honesty, accountability, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Today's Americans face the same challenge. The hidden fault lines within the nation, economic, racial, cultural, institutional, did not emerge naturally. They were shaped, deepened, and exploited by those who recognized that controlling the story often means controlling the future. But the power to rewrite history also exists in reverse. Citizens can reclaim the narrative. They can choose accuracy over mythology, democratic participation over resignation, and collective responsibility over the false promise of isolated individualism. In that sense, the struggle unfolding across the United States is not simply a political conflict. It is a battle over the meaning of the nation itself, over who belongs, who decides, and which version of America will guide the generations to come. And as history shows, the outcome will depend not on inevitability, but on engagement. Democracy is a story that must be continually defended, continually retold, and continually renewed. One of the most consequential and least understood developments in modern American life is the slow, almost imperceptible weakening of the very institutions that once held the republic together. Democracies do not simply collapse in a single dramatic moment. More often, they erode through a series of small surrenders, procedural shortcuts, political manipulations, and the gradual acceptance of norms once considered unthinkable. Today's America is shaped by these quiet fractures, many of which have accumulated over decades, largely out of public view. To see the fault lines clearly, we must step back and examine how each institutional pillar has been strained, twisted, or hollowed out. The United States Congress, once the central arena for negotiation and compromise, has become increasingly paralyzed. This paralysis did not happen overnight. It began when political leaders discovered that obstruction could yield greater partisan rewards than cooperation. In the 1990s, legislative brinkmanship became a strategy rather than an exception. Shutdowns were deployed as political tools. Filibusters transformed from rare protest tactics into routine weapons. Committees that once prided themselves on bipartisan inquiry were restructured to enhance partisan messaging. Over time, Congress shifted from an institution concerned with governance to one oriented towards spectacle. The more dysfunctional it became, the more political operatives cited its dysfunction as evidence that government itself could not be trusted, an argument that conveniently justified further erosion. This weakening of Congress produced significant downstream effects. As lawmakers refused to legislate on pressing issues, immigration, infrastructure, healthcare, climate, economic inequality, the executive branch expanded its power to fill the vacuum. Presidents of both parties increasingly governed through executive orders, regulatory adjustments, and emergency declarations. While such measures were often necessary to address immediate crises, they also set precedents that future leaders could exploit. A system designed to prevent the concentration of power gradually drifted toward exactly that. Even more troubling, the normalization of executive dominance made it easier for political actors to argue that the presidency should be insulated from accountability, transforming a constitutional office into a quasi-monarchical one in the eyes of supporters. The judiciary, particularly the Supreme Court, followed a similar trajectory of politicization. For much of American history, the court's authority derived from the perception that it existed above partisan conflict. But as confirmation battles intensified, and as lifetime appointments became strategic prizes, the court's legitimacy grew fragile. Senate leaders blocked nominations, shortened deliberation periods, and changed long-standing norms to secure ideological control. These maneuvers did not merely alter the composition of the court, they signaled to the public that judicial interpretation was no longer a matter of constitutional principle, but of political conquest. When a significant portion of citizens views the judiciary as an extension of one faction rather than an impartial arbiter, the foundation of the legal system cracks. Meanwhile, State legislatures, often operating with far less public scrutiny, became laboratories for minority rule. Through aggressive gerrymandering, lawmakers drew districts that ensured their own reelection regardless of public opinion. In some states, a party with fewer votes consistently won overwhelming legislative majorities. This structural distortion created a feedback loop. Lawmakers insulated from electoral accountability passed laws that further restricted voting access, which in turn reinforced their control. The rhetoric of election integrity was used to justify measures that reduced early voting, limited absentee ballots, purged voter rolls, and consolidated power over election administration. Each measure appeared technical, even bureaucratic, but taken together, they represented a profound recalibration of democratic participation. Another institution under strain is the free press. For generations, journalism served as a counterweight to political power. But media fragmentation, corporate consolidation, and the rise of partisan outlets reshaped the information ecosystem. As trust in journalism declined, a decline actively encouraged by political leaders seeking to evade scrutiny, the press's ability to provide a shared factual foundation weakened. The emergence of algorithm-driven social media accelerated this trend, rewarding outrage over nuance and virality over accuracy. Disinformation networks flourished, and foreign actors exploited the chaos. The result is a nation where citizens inhabit parallel realities, making democratic deliberation exponentially more difficult. Even institutions not traditionally considered political, public universities, libraries, scientific agencies have come under attack. Efforts to restrict curriculum, remove books, manipulate scientific findings, or intimidate public servants represent more than cultural disputes. They are attempts to control knowledge itself. Authoritarian movements throughout history have understood that undermining expertise is a prerequisite for consolidating power. When citizens no longer trust educators, researchers, or civil servants, they are left with fewer resources to evaluate political claims, making them more susceptible to manipulation. Yet perhaps the most underestimated institutional fracture lies within civic life. Community organizations, local news outlets, neighborhood associations, and volunteer networks once served as the connective tissue of American democracy. They provided spaces for people of different backgrounds to interact, deliberate, and recognize one another's humanity. But as economic pressures mounted, longer work hours, rising living costs, declining job stability, participation in civic life waned, social isolation grew, and into that vacuum stepped digital platforms optimized not for community, but for engagement, where inflammatory content receives the most visibility. The weakening of civic bonds makes it easier for political figures to cultivate resentment, suspicion, and division. Taken individually, each of these institutional strains might appear manageable, but together, they create a landscape where democratic norms can be bent with far less resistance. A Congress that cannot legislate, a judiciary viewed as partisan, state governments insulated from accountability, a fragmented press, a politicized educational sphere, and a fraying civic culture. These are the ingredients that allow minority rule to flourish. They do not guarantee democratic collapse, but they make it conceivable. And as history shows, democracies rarely fall because citizens actively choose authoritarianism. They fall because people grow accustomed to dysfunction, because institutional guardrails weaken gradually, and because those seeking power exploit these openings with increasing boldness. Still, it would be a mistake to view this erosion as irreversible. Throughout American history, institutional renewal has followed periods of institutional decay. The Progressive Era confronted corporate capture of government by expanding public oversight. The New Deal responded to economic collapse by redefining the role of the federal government. The Civil Rights Movement forced the country to confront its own laws and live up to its written ideals. At each juncture, renewal came not from institutional leaders alone, but from citizens who refused to accept a broken system as permanent. The United States now stands at a similar inflection point. The hidden fault lines within its institutions reveal a system strained but not yet shattered, challenged but not yet defeated. And as always, the question is not whether institutions can survive, but whether the public will insist that they do. Democracy, after all, is not self-executing. It requires vigilance, engagement, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about both the past and the present. The future of the Republic depends on whether Americans choose to repair these fractures or resign themselves to living atop them. To understand the hidden fault lines shaping today's America, we must look beyond institutions and political structures and examine something even more elemental: the struggle over who belongs. Every era of American conflict, from the Revolution to Reconstruction, from the New Deal to the Civil Rights Movement, has ultimately revolved around the same core question: what does it mean to be part of the American community? Today's turmoil is no different. The nation is undergoing a profound renegotiation of identity, citizenship, and national purpose, and the outcome of this renegotiation will determine the character of the Republic for generations to come. The concept of belonging has never been straightforward in the United States. From the beginning, the promise of universal equality coexisted with systems of exclusion. The Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men were created equal, even as millions were enslaved and indigenous peoples were driven from their lands. After the Civil War, the Reconstruction Amendments expanded the definition of citizenship, but violent backlash sought to reverse those gains. In the 20th century, new waves of immigrants, new social movements, and new legal protections further widened the circle of belonging, only to encounter renewed resistance from those who believed the nation's identity should remain narrow, static, and controlled by a privileged few. The modern struggle over belonging accelerated in the late 20th century as demographic, cultural, and economic changes reshaped the United States. Immigration increased, urban centers diversified, and young Americans embraced more inclusive definitions of identity. At the same time, globalization, deindustrialization, and technological change disrupted familiar economic landscapes, leaving many communities uncertain about their place in the future. This convergence produced a political opportunity for those willing to exploit fear. Instead of addressing economic anxiety through policy, political leaders reframed it as cultural displacement. They argued that the country was being taken from its rightful owners, a message strategically designed to activate resentment, nostalgia, and a sense of embattled identity. This narrative gained particular traction in areas experiencing economic decline. Factories closed, small towns hollowed out, wages stagnated, and educational opportunities dwindled. In these conditions, it became easier for political operatives to persuade citizens that cultural change, rather than policy decisions, was responsible for their struggles. The language of belonging became a tool of political mobilization. Real Americans, our culture, our values. These phrases carried an implicit message. Some people counted as rightful heirs to the American story, while others were merely guests, interlopers, or threats. At the same time, a different vision of belonging was emerging, one grounded in pluralism, shared responsibility, and democratic participation. Younger generations embraced multiculturalism not as a threat, but as a strength. Major cities became laboratories of diversity, innovation, and cross-cultural exchange. Social movements demanded recognition for long marginalized groups, arguing that the nation's ideals could only be fulfilled by including those previously excluded from the circle of citizenship. These movements did not seek to erase American history, but to complete it, to align the country's practices with its promises. The collision of these two visions, exclusive belonging versus inclusive belonging, forms one of the most volatile fault lines in American politics today. It influences debates over immigration, voting rights, education, policing, religious freedom, and reproductive autonomy. It shapes whether citizens view their neighbors with suspicion or empathy. And it determines whether political leaders pursue power through division or through representation. Nowhere is this conflict more evident than in the debate over public education. Schools have historically served as the primary arena in which nations define their identity. Curricula teach not only facts but values: what is honored, what is erased, what is deemed essential to national memory. In recent years, battles over teaching race, gender, and American history have become proxy wars for the broader question of who belongs. Efforts to restrict books, criminalize discussions of systemic inequity, or reshape curricula to emphasize heritage over accuracy are not merely local disputes. They are attempts to impose a singular, exclusionary narrative on a diverse nation. These cultural conflicts are intertwined with political ones. When certain groups are portrayed as perpetual outsiders, it becomes easier to justify limiting their political power. Policies restricting voting access often disproportionately affect communities of color, students, and low-income Americans, groups whose increasing political participation challenges entrenched hierarchies. When lawmakers argue that expanding the electorate dilutes real citizenship, they are echoing centuries-old claims used to uphold systems of exclusion. The debate is not simply about ballots. It is about who is deemed worthy of participating in the nation's future. The rhetoric of belonging also shapes immigration policy. While migration has defined the United States since its inception, the modern narrative presents immigration as a zero-sum threat, implying that new arrivals diminish the claims of existing citizens. This framing ignores the country's long history of renewal through immigration. It disregards economic evidence, showing that immigrants fuel growth, innovation, and demographic stability. More importantly, it transforms people into symbols, objects onto which political leaders can project fear, resentment, or moral panic. This kind of rhetoric has always been a hallmark of anti-democratic movements, which rely on dividing the population into us and them. Yet, despite these challenges, there are powerful signs that the circle of belonging is expanding. Multiracial coalitions have risen to demand equal rights. Record numbers of women and people of color have been elected to public office. Americans from all backgrounds are engaging in civic life at levels not seen in decades. Even in communities historically resistant to change, younger generations are redefining local identities, blending tradition with inclusivity. These developments reveal that while the forces of exclusion are loud, they are not inevitable. The battle for belonging is not solely about policy or politics. It is about the emotional core of the American experiment. Democracies survive when citizens believe they share a common destiny, when they recognize one another's humanity, and when they accept that the freedoms they enjoy are tied to the freedoms of others. Authoritarian movements, by contrast, rely on shrinking the circle of belonging, convincing people that safety comes from hierarchy rather than community, from purity rather than pluralism. The question facing the United States is therefore not simply whether it will remain a democracy, but what kind of democracy it will be. Will it embrace the inclusive vision articulated in its founding ideals, or will it retreat into a narrower, more fearful version of itself? The answer will depend on whether citizens choose to expand the circle of belonging or allow it to contract, whether they see diversity as a threat or as the fulfillment of the American promise. History shows that belonging is never permanently settled. It must be reaffirmed, renegotiated, and defended in every generation. Today's Americans stand at a defining moment in that ongoing struggle. And the path they choose will shape not only the nation's institutions, but its identity, its understanding of who we are. If the hidden fault lines running through today's America seem overwhelming: fractured institutions, competing narratives, contested identities, it is because the country is living through one of the most significant democratic crossroads in its history. The conflicts we see today are not isolated events, but the culmination of long unresolved struggles, each one echoing earlier battles for power, representation, and the meaning of citizenship. Yet history also shows that moments like these, though turbulent, often precede profound renewal. The United States has reinvented itself before. The question now is whether it can do so again, and whether its citizens will choose to carry that work forward. To understand what is at stake, We must return to the founding contradiction at the heart of the American experiment: the belief in universal equality paired with systems designed to exclude. This contradiction has never fully disappeared. Instead, it has resurfaced whenever the nation expands its circle of belonging. Each expansion triggers backlash, revealing old hierarchies struggling to preserve their power. Reconstruction brought the 14th and 15th Amendments and white supremacist terror. The New Deal expanded economic rights and left many communities of color excluded. The Civil Rights era dismantled legal segregation and sparked a decades-long political realignment built on coded appeals to resentment. Today's conflicts follow this same pattern. Progress toward a more inclusive democracy has provoked a wave of political movements determined to reverse that progress, often by undermining the very institutions meant to uphold equality. But the lesson of history is not that expansion of democracy is doomed to fail. It is that progress requires sustained effort, vigilance, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. The abolitionists did not prevail because slavery simply collapsed under its own weight. They prevailed because they built coalitions, changed public opinion, and forced the country to reckon with its own ideals. The civil rights movement did not succeed because segregationists surrendered. It succeeded because ordinary people, students, teachers, clergy, activists, refused to accept injustice as the natural order. In each case, renewal came from citizens who saw themselves as stewards of the republic rather than passive observers of it. Today, the need for such stewardship is as great as ever. The forces exploiting America's fault lines, those who seek power by deepening division, undermining trust, and rewriting the nation's story, are well-organized, well-funded, and deeply motivated. They rely on a strategy as old as Republican government itself: convince citizens that democracy no longer works, that institutions cannot be trusted, that neighbors are enemies, and that only a strong leader can restore order. But history is clear on this point. Democracies do not fall because their opponents are strong. They fall because their defenders grow complacent. The most hopeful trend in modern American life is that complacency is eroding. Civic engagement is rising, especially among young Americans who see democracy not as a static inheritance, but as an active responsibility. Workers are organizing in industries once thought impossible to unionize. Voters in states across the political spectrum have passed ballot measures protecting reproductive rights, expanding voting access, and securing fairer district maps. Communities long marginalized from political power are increasingly shaping elections, public policy, and national conversations. These developments reveal a fundamental truth: the will to preserve democracy remains alive even in the face of extraordinary pressure. Still, renewal is not guaranteed. Democratic revitalization requires more than participation. It requires clarity about the challenges ahead. One challenge is the continued erosion of shared reality. The nation cannot function if citizens cannot agree on basic facts. Strengthening local journalism, supporting independent media, and restoring transparency within government are critical steps toward rebuilding that shared foundation. Another challenge is institutional reform. Congress must modernize its procedures to reduce gridlock. Courts must operate with greater transparency. States must adopt fair redistricting practices. Election systems must be insulated from partisan manipulation. These reforms are not partisan goals. They are necessary steps to rebuild the infrastructure of self-government. Perhaps the most difficult challenge is the emotional one: rebuilding trust. Trust in one another, trust in institutions, trust in the idea that the American project, messy, imperfect, and incomplete though it is still worth defending. Trust cannot be legislated. It must be cultivated through shared experiences, shared commitments, and shared understandings of what the nation aspires to be. This kind of trust requires leaders willing to tell the truth even when it is inconvenient, and citizens willing to listen even when the truth is hard to hear. What gives this moment its power is that Americans are not only confronting the fractures within their democracy, they are confronting them with unprecedented clarity. The attempt to overturn an election, the rise of political violence, the spread of disinformation, the attacks on public education, the erosion of reproductive rights, the targeted suppression of voters. Each of these events has revealed how fragile democracy becomes when its norms are taken for granted. But they have also revealed something else: the extraordinary resilience of citizens who choose to defend democratic values even when doing so carries personal risk. The future of the Republic will depend on whether that resilience grows. If Americans choose cynicism, disengagement, or despair, the fault lines will deepen, and those seeking power through division will exploit that vacuum. But if they choose engagement, if they choose community over isolation, if they choose truth over narrative manipulation, the Republic can emerge stronger, more inclusive, and more aligned with its founding ideals. The American story has never been linear. It has moved forward and backward, expanded and contracted, confronted and evaded its contradictions. Yet through every crisis, one constant has remained: the belief that democracy is worth the struggle. Today's citizens inherit that responsibility. They stand at a moment where the choices they make at the ballot box, in their communities, in their conversations, in their willingness to defend one another's rights, will determine whether the United States continues its march toward a more perfect union or retreats into division and hierarchy. The unfinished work of the Republic now belongs to them. And if history is any guide, Americans have risen to such challenges before. They can do so again. The path forward is neither easy nor guaranteed, but it is open, and the story of the nation's future will be written by those who choose to walk it.